Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast, and today we have a really special episode ready for you and a fantastic guest. We're going to be talking to Bruno Carvalho, who is the chair of the program of History and Literature and a professor at Harvard University, where he teaches courses on cities and the intersection of cities and history. He is the author of Porous City, A Cultural History of Rio de Janeiro. And for the purposes of this episode, he's also the author of the recently published The Invention of the Future, A History of Cities in the Modern World. And what an important topic to be talking about, particularly for people interested in preserving them and planning cities of the future and making sure that history persists into the future. I think it's just a really timely conversation. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind listeners to be sure to rate, review, subscribe to PreserveCast. And if you're enjoying what you're listening to, give it a share on social media if you're a part of a group or any type of share on social media helps a great deal in kind of getting the word out about these episodes, particularly one that you find fascinating. So tell people about it. Before we dive into the subject matter material, we really like to get to know the people that we're talking to. So, Bruno, what is the path that you took that took you not only to studying history and literature and the history of cities, but studying it at a place as important and as impressive as Harvard University and teaching it at Harvard, I should say. What was the path and what sort of sparked all this interest?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, Nick. I love the podcast, and it's just a pleasure to be here. Where to begin with that large question? So I grew up in Brazil, between 2 cities that are very, very different. Rio, sort of a city with old bones, dense, walkable, lively, chaotic. And Brasilia, which was, the result of a very sort of utopian modernist dream, but where I lived basically on the city's edges, sort of beyond where the formal city ended in some ways, which kind of exposed me to very different kinds of spaces, a little bit more of a wildness and wilderness to it. And Rio as a city was very important for me growing up for reasons we don't have to get into. There was, a bit of an unusual upbringing, and being in the city kind of exposed me to the world as a very complicated place that was larger than my immediate family surroundings and so on, and kind of opened my sense of possibility, right? So it's this very classic, what becomes a very classic story in this book that I basically lived through as a child, right? The idea that in a city, you're not limited to whatever role is assigned to you based on birth, right? And that's a story both of promise and frustration, both for lots of the people that the book is concerned about, but also in my case. So through this very roundabout way, I ended up in the U.S. I had the dream of migrating from very early on. I was exposed to U.S. schools through movies and so on, and that was a dream for as long as I can remember. And then I ended up in the U.S. for college, met the woman who's now my wife, made a family here, and started studying literature. I was always fascinated with stories. In retrospect, it was always sort of clear that I was interested in literature and the ways that it mediates people's relationships to spaces and places. So from the beginning, cities were at the heart of my research. I studied with some wonderful people here at Harvard, the historian Kenneth Maxwell, who was very important for keeping me sober and always remembering to, allow the evidence to kind of dictate where you go as you think and write. And then on the other side of that, a cultural historian of cities who passed away named Nicolau Sevchenko, who just had this extraordinarily imaginative and creative capacity to find patterns in the past, and would give these sort of 3-hour lectures that would start with the social organization of ants, take us through the ethical duality of Zoroastrian cosmologies, and somehow you would end up in modernist planning. And for those 3 hours, it all made sense, and that was all very stimulating. There's one quick story that I'll tell you because I think it might be of interest to listeners since it's tied to preservation. I should say, by the way, as a parenthesis, I do in this book, in the preface, the preface is in the first person, and it does tell a story that's different from the one I just told now about how I came to have this book within me. So hopefully, readers will get that there. But something that's not there that I was thinking about, because I knew you were going to ask this question. I've heard the podcast before. I grew up in a household that didn't particularly prize buildings, architecture, cities. It wasn't. There weren't a lot of books around, but my mother had this book of Italian ruins, sort of overlaid with drawings that showed what these buildings would have been like. And I spent so much of my childhood, of course, this is before screens, just dreaming of what it would be like to be in these places and somehow have this connection to people, long before us. And part of my aspiration of migrating and making a life for myself in this country had to do with just having the resources to go to these places and sort of touch some of these walls, which eventually I did in my early 20s.
What a cool, that we didn't get into the social organization of ants, but that was a fun answer to that question. we went on an interesting path. One weird question I have for you, just that kind of piqued my interest, is you said that American films got you excited or interested in. Were there a handful of them that you were like, oh, that's what it's going to be like when I get there? There?
For sure. What's the one about the teacher that the one where the kids declare the Whitman poem? Dead Poet Society.
Dead Poet Society. Okay, all right. I thought that might give a flavor to this conversation if people knew the kind of films that you liked, because you obviously care a lot about story, and that's a big part of this. I could restate or read what the publisher gave us in terms of what the central argument of the book is, but I've got the author here. Why don't you tell us, like, what story, since story matters to you, were you trying to tell in this book? And then we can kind of dig into it, because I've got a chance to take a look at it and talk a little bit about some of these arguments. But what story were you trying to tell? What were you inspired by? And I suppose what also led you to writing this book?
Yeah, I guess fundamentally it's a story about how we, as a species got here. How our planet became so urban. It starts with the ending of my previous book, which had been a history of Brazil and Rio told through a neighborhood that was extraordinarily multi-ethnic. It was known simultaneously as Little Africa and as a Jewish neighborhood with several Yiddish newspapers and so on. And the book ends with the construction of a highway over this city. And what I sort of learned as I was writing that was that this was a story about competing visions of the future, right? And the vision that the future should be car-centric, and that a modern city should not be concerned with these sort of histories of multi-ethnic encounters and so on, but rather with a certain particular vision of progress, is what sort of explained these historical developments, right? So, this was now some 15 years ago. So ever since I've been teaching and thinking about the history of cities and the evolution of cities and the experiences of cities through that lens, right? As a set of competing visions, desires, aspirations over what the future ought to be like. So for this book, the first question was really, where does that begin in earnest? And I think it begins in the 18th century. And that's where the book, the introduction tries to tell sort of fit this within an even larger story. Indigenous Tupi did not live in forests, imagining that their environments or built environments would be radically different in the future. Nor did medieval Parisians, nor did peasants in what's now China. And in the 18th century, that begins to change, right? People begin to imagine a future that was not predetermined by the divine, but that rather they as humans could shape. And the shape that took was by and large urban, right? This coincided in Western Europe with the boom of urbanization. So the book basically tracks that history from Western Europe throughout much of the Atlantic, and then eventually in more recent decades as a global history, right? The story of how we essentially began to live with the premise that the future will be radically different from past and present, and that it's something that we can build. That's the history of humans over the past few centuries, and that's of course the history of urban development.
It's interesting in that one of the things that you point out that I took from it is sort of this common thread that planners have a vision. These idealists have a vision for what it's going to become, and that oftentimes reality defies those predictions. What do you think? Given that this sort of Enlightenment concept sort of drives this idea, and these brilliant planners and brilliant minds are putting these things together, why does so often in practice do you find that the reality is different? I mean, there are things that they just can't account for. What is that a common thread? Is that something that we see across, and what does that say about us and our ability to really plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a key question for the book, and in different historical moments there are different answers. There are different aspirations, right? You had in sort of the height of planning powers this confidence that they really could figure this out. This came from the brilliance of figures like Olmsted, Cerdá in Spain, and so on. But also, having lived through the telegraph and railroads, it was almost inconceivable that the kinds of changes that people had lived through could repeat themselves in the future, right? And yet they did. And these kinds of technological changes unleashed processes that were absolutely impossible to predict, right? Including the scale of urban growth. But what I think you do have as a rule over the 300 or so years that the book covers is, one, the sense that cities are always more than the sum of their parts. It's just impossible to capture them within a set of variables, and even when you do, change is sort of too quick to keep up. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That means that we should be sort of humble enough to understand that it's simply impossible to predict. And I think that should inform how we plan. So one, there's one. One way in which this is expressed in the book is through the idea that reasonable predictions underestimate the range of possible outcomes. Simplest way to think about that is, like, if you send people back in time over these 300 years, if you send people back in time to describe to people in a given present, this is what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years, they'd be the first to be laughed off of a room of very serious people, right? That's true for us. If you send people back to 2008 and tell them Donald Trump would be a 2-term president, they're going to laugh in your face, right? So throughout the history of cities, that's sort of a constant, right?
Yeah, that is a constant, but it doesn't stop. I mean, every municipality in America has a planning department.
Yeah.
And some of that is not to the level of what we're talking about here. And you kind of get towards that at the end, where it's sort of this idea of like, can we even do this again? I mean, that's like a bigger question. Maybe we can address that at the end, but like, the kind of planning that you're talking about, I think one of the examples you give, one of the projects that are, big case studies that you dig into is the New York City Commissioner's Plan of 1811. And, one of the things that sort of struck me about that too is like how often, with the exception of things like Brasilia, like how often do we have the chance to like plan out a new town like this? I mean, this is kind of singular, or not singular, but is that a relic of the past? I guess that's one thing. Are we still doing this? And did something so pervasive on the New York City landscape, did that also defy those predictions? Like something like that, which maybe you can talk about the plan and what that is for people who aren't familiar with it. And then is that an example of where it defied predictions, or is this an example of where they got it right and it persists and it's what they wanted?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. So for the listeners, so again, this very sort of large story, but the book gets into with great level of detail certain case studies that are representative of major changes in planning culture and in the experience of cities from the ground up, right? So there's a sort of dual bottom up, top down kind of perspective. The first one is the reconstruction of Lisbon after this earthquake destroys, the core of the historic city. And there it was a city that stood out from previous planning because it was not dictated by, a sort of royal or religious pressures, but rather by trade, by the sort of more modern sense of, hierarchies of values and so on, right? So it had a commerce square at the middle rather than a cathedral or a palace. And it was a city that was built in a very rational way, right? It was a city that was built to avoid another destruction through earthquakes, right? So with anti-seismic technologies and so on and so forth. So it's still there, so it largely worked. But of course, this moment in Portuguese history did not last very long, and there was sort of a backlash to this more secular turn. Now, the Commissioner's Plan, not long after that, some 60 years after, in the beginning of the 19th century, is even more radically secular, right? If you looked at it, you can't tell where the center is, right? It doesn't really assign a program to the plan. It's just a grid. And in a way, that was sort of a historical accident. I mean, obviously, I tell the story in more responsible ways, but you can almost think that the commissioners kind of phoned it in, right? They weren't really designers. This wasn't really their thing. They did the grid, which is a sort of, classic form. And it sort of worked in a way because it was so open-ended, right? They had no idea that New York City was going to grow as it started to after the Erie Canal and so on and so forth. But this very sort of open-end structure ended up allowing the city to evolve in all kinds of ways that they weren't prepared for, including absorbing Central Park, which was of course not part of the plan. And we can't possibly imagine the Manhattan today without it. A Central Park which was central only from the perspective of the city, right? From the perspective of the future, because when it was built, it was not at the center, but rather in the margins of the city. So, fast forwards to the 19th century, where you had planning with great confidence in its ability to figure things out for posterity. That included a lot of mistakes. Now, by the early 20th century, I think planning as a profession, especially in places like Germany and the United States, had really absorbed a lot of lessons from what for them had been a recent past, and had really figured out that you had to plan for change. That there were certain things that you want to pay attention to. If there's population growth, you want to sort of relax zoning laws and take, transit lines over there to sort of allow it to absorb demand and pressures and so on. Unfortunately, a lot of those cultures were just not particularly powerful, especially as the car came by, that sort of sucked up all the oxygen and basically predetermined where cities went. So I think, today we have a planning profession that is a lot wiser than it, had been in earlier moments in its history. It's probably in a way that 100 years ago is not a bad parallel. There's sort of a lot of knowledge and a lot of best practices that, if enacted, would leave us in much better place than we are. It's just not a very powerful discipline, right?
That's an interesting point. I mean, because one of the things that I was kind of getting at in that question, and probably rolled too many questions into one. But
I know my answer is clumsy.
Yeah, no, I know it, but I mean, well, first and foremost, as people are listening to this, we have a link in the show notes so you can pick up a copy of this. It's instructive and it's helpful. It's a good read, and it's also just I was telling Bruno before we even hit record, like I love these sorts of topics where we dig into something in great detail that impacts our everyday lives or impacts the way we travel and visit a place, but kind of happens almost subconsciously. It's like breathing. It happens, and then you realize, oh my gosh, this grid experience is impacting me. So I think that these sorts of topics are always so fascinating and so interesting because they happen sort of in the background, and it's good to know how and why they happen. So the link is there in the show notes. One of the questions I was going to ask, though, is, sort of, could we or even should we do this type of planning again? And how does that relate to sort of the Jane Jacobs approach of the world? So, that's sort of a rejection of this idea of, and that's like the full-blown version of this sort of reimposing a vision, particularly a car-centric vision, through the minds of, Robert Moses and others. But how does this square with where we stand now? I know that kind of goes even a little bit further than your historical study, but given that you've thought about this so much, is this something we could do now? Is this something, this type of planning, or is this sort of a relic of the past, and is that where it should live?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the details, right? On the how. So to go back to something, you quickly said, right? Our cities have planning departments and so on, and there's a lot of sort of knowledge now in a lot of our cities' planning departments. But one of the reasons that they're not as powerful as they were, in the late 19th century or early 20th century, is that the actual scale of the built environment is metropolitan, right? So we don't actually have agencies equipped to coordinate across municipalities, right? Boston, a small fraction of the greater Boston's population is within our municipal boundaries, right? So for transit and housing, if you're to plan adequately, you really, really need to be able to operate at larger scales, right? In some places you can do that, right? So Chinese cities have much larger municipal boundaries, and that actually allows them to sometimes plan more effectively. They sometimes don't have the enough accountability mechanisms, and mistakes get made too. But scale really, really matters, I think, to answer your question. One of the, I think, lessons from history is that, one, we should be humble about lessons of history, right? The New York City's commissioner's plan, the population at the time was a few tens of thousands, right? That many people arrive to some growing cities today in just a matter of days, right? So the scale of contemporary challenges really, really is of a different order. Now, there are certain lessons that we get from histories, which I think have more to do with starting points than necessarily what we do from now. Starting points, from the perspective of like, how do we diagnose the situation? And one is, if a place is growing or the need for housing is growing, and you sometimes get that without population growth, right? With different family dynamics, right? If you have smaller families, you need more housing units, even if the population is stable. If that's the condition, you need to make room for people to live in places, right? And that will take building. And if you don't do that, there's going to have cascading effects, right? It might be home appreciation for homeowners, which is, of course, inflation for renters, greater homelessness, sprawl, people unable to move, people aging in homes that are too big for them because there's not anywhere else to go, people in abusive relationships that can't rent because the housing market is too tight, and so on. So the starting point is people do not disappear if you don't build for them, right? So you have to plan for growth if demand is growing. And the other, you have to figure out how people are going to get places. Now, the specifics really depends on what the starting points are for a particular place, right? So somewhere like Vienna, a city that owns a lot of land, they can, of course, experiment with social housing in a way that is fairly unique, right? In Tokyo, which is a place where you're already, at this point, already starting with great mass transit, you can do transit-oriented development and sort of absorb demand for new housing and so on and so forth. From Jacob, so I love that book. I've assigned that book so many times. Just a wonderful writer, thinker, so important for the history of preservation and so important for all of us that care about historic buildings. One other lesson from history that I write about is how often yesterday's solutions become tomorrow's problems, right? So density was a problem in the 19th century from a health perspective. We now have antibiotics. It's less of a problem, and it's a solution from an energy perspective, right? Density is more energy efficient and so on. Or for transit, right? If people have to cover greater distances, it's easier to organize traffic. I think that can be true for certain regulations, right? That were extraordinarily important for saving buildings, and that now have perhaps made it too hard to allow for new constructions. In Jacob's case, so Jacobs is in the book as in a moment where it was very important for progressive politics to say no to things, right? Excessively top-down development, right? Destruction of historic fabric and so on. But Jacobs also had a vision for the future, right? A future of walkable, compact, mixed-use, diverse cities. And I think that the legacy of Jacobs, in a way, lives in today in a form of progressive politics, which still thinks of it as of political virtue as saying no and stopping things, and we absolutely have to overcome that. Right? This is no longer 1961. This is a different moment, and we need to be able to say yes to things and to sort of, propose visions for the future again.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole Ezra Klein argument of abundance, and this idea, in some ways, this idea that we have forgotten how to build, and perhaps we've forgotten how to plan. I've seen it, and I think others have seen it, and I'm curious what you think about this, in smart growth, right? Where smart growth, here where we record Preservecast in the state of Maryland, sort of pioneered here by an earlier governor, Paris Glendening, and this idea that we're going to hold the line on sprawl and then we're going to reinvest in existing communities and make them better. And we've done and I've talked to planning directors about this and everything. Everybody kind of agrees. We've done a great job on holding the line in sprawl in Maryland. We have a whole bunch of different programs and regulations and things that make it more difficult to just keep sprawling out.
Yeah.
But we haven't really created an environment where it's very easy to build within existing areas.
Right.
So it's sort of like this, what you were talking about with Jane Jacobs, where it's not only saving these dense sort of walkable communities, but then it's like creating these livable communities of the future. And we got half of Jacobs. We got Jacobs' defense of the existing place, but not the Jacobs vision of the future. And one of the questions I had for you that kind of ties back into this then is, what does this tell us? What does all of this research in this book tell us about the future in that way, where it comes to things like sprawl repair, where it comes to things like the future of our main streets, or, you hear a lot of arguments about, what does the future of commercial look like in sort of an internet age?
Right.
You've pointed out that we need to be humble in our planning, but humility doesn't breed a lot of excitement. So do we have to be bold? What does that look like? What is the lesson of history there?
Yeah, Nick, you're getting me into trouble. There's so many open threads, so much to talk about. And I do hope, you're going to get much more organized and articulate answers in the book for all of these questions, particularly in the epilogue. But let me try to answer by weaving in an idea about preservation, and then I'll try to connect to some of your questions. Preservation, I guess, etymologically, it's sort of before and then protecting, safeguarding, right? So you want to safeguard or protect something from something happening that would destroy it, right? So it can be preserving fruit so they don't rot, right? And it became a very crucial way through which maintain a connection to an urban fabric, right? And basically protect from destruction buildings and spaces that we care about and that others have cared about, right? And just a sense of where we've been in the past, which I do think is important for the future. But preservation is always about the future, right? What do we want to keep from the past into the future? And in a way, we've done a great job since Jacobs, or a much better job at preserving this compact fabric of somewhere like the West Village, right? But the constant in a city is always change. So when we're opting to preserve, an aesthetic sense, the built fabric, and we set it in amber, that's going to set off all kinds of social change, right? That might be invisible if you're only paying attention to buildings, but is showing up in the businesses, in the demographics, and so on, right? Places, they'll become wealthier, they'll become older, and so on and so forth. So what do we do about that? It's not, you don't want to destroy a historic block in the West Village to build apartment buildings, but then you have to build them somewhere, right? And somewhere where people can sort of still access these places. If you want to preserve the sense of vitality and dynamism that made these places special to someone like Jacobs in the 1960s, right? So there, I think that, again, the answers depend on the particular contexts, and they must involve smart growth. I think the work you all have been doing is so important. But my sense is that it has to be sort of an all of the above, right? So, for example, what has happened in Jersey City, in the New York metropolitan area, is also crucial, right? Because it allows then newcomers to arrive, and the city is still affordable for them if they have high enough salaries for a place like Jersey City, but they might not need the intergenerational wealth that has sort of turned the West Village into a playground, either for the uber wealthy or for, again, people that are born within intergenerational wealth. So I think, vertical growth in a place like New York absolutely needs to be part of the approach. But it needs to be coordinated across jurisdictions and municipalities, right? So that
I'm hearing that clearly from you. I think that's an interesting thing where it's like you've pointed that out, and is that something that you captured, kind of taking us back to the book? You've pointed out the need for this metropolitan sort of vision of this, and we see that here in Maryland, and we see it all across the country, where the urban area might be one jurisdiction, and then everything that surrounds it is where people commute from, and they're sort of at cross purposes. Are we at a point where we're sort of ahistorically operating compared to the snapshots you give us, the case studies in the book, where they were able to kind of plan and dream big without these artificial boundaries around them? Is that one of the challenges that the book sort of uncovers, in a sense? Would you say that because you've come back to that several times, this need for sort of a metropolitan, a larger vision. We don't, in many cases, have that. Is that one of the things that you feel like really plagues us?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that there is a sense of so the lesson that people in the second half of the 19th century took, or at least a lot of planners, from the immense technological changes they lived through, was that the past need not serve as a yardstick, and we should be experimenting with how we organize ourselves and how we plan, right? So at the time, people did not necessarily take for granted sort of jurisdictions, right? Like in Paris, they went through annexations and so on. And I think that should be, I would love for those conversations to be happening. I mean, part of the reason that I think we should be thinking as an all of the above approach to some of these challenges is that what's politically feasible in Boston and Maryland, in Lagos, or in Beijing is very, very different, right? So the starting point should be, where's there less friction? At the same time, change often happens quicker than we imagine once the conditions are set. That happened with the victory of the car, for example. That could happen with a return to mass transit, or even smaller scale multimodal approaches like bike lanes and e-bikes and so on and so forth. I do think this idea that yesterday's solutions can be today's problems. You can invert that. Yesterday's problems can be today's solutions too, right? So the car was yesterday's solution. It was a phenomenal technology to move people from point A to point B across, large spaces. It becomes a major problem when there's too many of them, because it's just not a very efficient way to move people around. So compact, denser agglomerations, I think, have an enduring appeal throughout history. Economists see that, explain this through the language of agglomeration, right? And efficiencies and so on. But we're deeply social beings, right? People like being around people. That doesn't show up in scholarship, because I think people that write tend to be less like that. So it's really low hanging fruit, right? To basically get out of the way if people are trying to experiment with compact living, so long as you're, again, not destroying historic fabric, can really, I think, make a difference. One, to the people that get to move there, to the environment, but I think also to sort of breaking the sense of paralysis that we have in the relationship to the future, right?
Yeah, I think that for me was a takeaway in kind of reading this is using this as perhaps evidence or inspiration for how our predecessors addressed these problems, but also what they brought to the solutions that they generated. And I like that idea, and maybe a good place to kind of leave this part of the conversation, where you talk about how the work that you covered in these case studies, there is a common thread amongst many of them, where it's like the past need not bind us. And right. I think all too often, particularly in the halls of government and in planning practices and things like that, we sort of set up these arbitrary boundaries that prevent us from moving forward. Well, that's on the other side of a zoning area. We can't, do this, or that's in a different municipality. How could we possibly work together? And that's not gonna shape the future that many of us need, or bring down the price of housing, which you kind of touched on there.
Yeah. So just super quickly, to give another sense of a larger arc within the book. I mean, the book tells a story of when people imagine the future as something to be built, but in the present, people often imagine the future as something to be averted, right? The future will be climate change. It's sort of all these challenges and these problems that we're trying to avert. Now, I think imagining sort of horrible futures can generate antibodies in the present. But again, it can also sort of lead to a sense of paralysis. I think one way in which I think of the abundance conversation, just to touch on that, is that we've focused on energy, for example, from the perspective of trying to curb supply. So here at Harvard, we had the divestment from fossil fuels and so on. This is something that I was part of. But in retrospect, I think it would have been smarter to instead focus on the demand for energy efficient lifestyles, right? So if you actually built so that people need less fossil fuels, they'll be saving the planet, even if they don't care about it, right? And you can do that with less political opposition, at least ostensibly. And then the other larger story is that, a lot of political scientists write about this, is that the left and progressives, have been going through a major disillusionment with progress, in the last few decades. In this book, I write about the sort of enchantment with progress among planning circles in the 19th century and so on. And then the writers that could kind of tell that, look, It's always more complicated when you involve humans, right? Life is never as linear. There's going to be a lot left to chance. There's going to be losers and winners in these changes and so on and so forth. And we focused a lot on those kinds of voices, and I think that's been great. I mean, we have a very critical history of narratives about progress in the past, but I think we do well to recover a sense of the future as something that can be built, and I think we do well to recover a sense of the present that doesn't take for granted that things need to be as they are. Because again, radical change is sort of the norm in the last 300 years. So in that sense,
yeah, no, that was perfect. Like that's, if we were going to use a snapshot for this conversation, like that's lovely. And that's a really great way of sort of capturing all these different sort of themes that are at play here, but also gives people a sense for listening for why like a book like this is not just a recitation of the past or a story about what happened, but how it truly begins to and continues to shape our current world and should shape our thinking. This is a great book for policymakers to take a look at. This can tell you a story that this is the information before you jump into abundance. This is the kind of thing that you should understand to understand where all of that came from and the people sort of pushing for that growth previously. It sort of lines up the next question perfectly, which is, as we kind of draw to a conclusion here, the United States is going to be commemorating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Republic, of the nation, in 2026. And you've pointed out a few things that I think are kind of interesting for that moment. We ask preservationists that are with us, sort of people who work just in preservation or the built environment, what they're hoping for their communities and the constituents that they serve. I'm curious what you think about the 250th in the context of the built environment, of the urban environment. And I think a lot of times the 250th is perceived maybe not as much as an urban story sometimes, which is funny because the American Revolution unfolded in our cities, in Boston and New York, but these places have so radically changed. And Philadelphia, of course, they look very different. From your perspective, where you sit at Harvard, what are you thinking about the 250th, and do you have a hope for its legacy? Do you have a hope for how it impacts these stories of urban America? I know that's a big question, but it's just sort of like, where does the 250th sit in your mind? I just love to get to ask people that question and see where they're thinking about all of this.
Yeah, well, since that's next year, and it's a question about the future, what I've learned as a historian of the future is that we can only predict the past. So I'll answer by going back to the last major anniversary and into the 70s, and just reflecting on how this country's future has changed so much since then, right? It's a much more ethnically diverse country. I think now in 2025, in a way, a lot of what we could take for granted in the 70s, and even 5 years ago, we should not take for granted so much. The very discipline of history as something that matters, as something that depends on sort of well-resourced universities that care about funding these sort of things, are something that could conceivably be gone, in 50 years or 25 years. So there's a lot to celebrate in how we tell stories today with kinds of sensibilities that we didn't have in the 70s, right? So less focus on, the same kinds of historical protagonists and trying to think more bottom up and so on. But I wouldn't take for granted that will necessarily matter next year in the way that it might have even 5 years ago, right? I think that it's likely that this university, the 250th will be used to tell a story of this country that excludes certain actors in its present, right? At the same time, in the 1970s, cities were places to be saved. They were places in crisis. Today, they can be places of possibility and excitement in ways that I think they would have never predicted, back then or 50 years ago. I think that this is a story that the book tells, right? How the cities in the 90s, again, Seinfeld and Wakanda and so on, versus the dystopia, the places where you go to be robbed, or the places where the world ends, and so on and so forth. So I hope that the commemorations capture some of that. One last, and I also hope that those that are uncomfortable with the ways histories had been told in the 70s step into the fray and try to sort of connect these histories, right? Histories that allow sort of the public to feel a certain sense of pride over what's happened in this country, without, again, incurring the kinds of mistakes that we've done in the past. So, the old baby in the bathwater metaphor comes
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like what you said earlier, where it's, critical history is important, but there are moments to be celebrated and sort of to be uplifted.
And if I just may add a note about preservation specifically, one concern that I have over the role of public history just within the last few years is that a lot of historians have, in the stories they've told about the past, underestimated how often backlash happens to the kinds of victories that most of us in this field champion. And I think there's a lesson there for preservation. I do worry, and I get this from my interface with students, that you're going to get that when you have preservation as a tool to stop housing and not to preserve actually historically significant buildings, you will get a backlash from people that begin to say, you know what, this celebration of the past is just an excuse for rich people to keep their own and keep me out from the story of this country or from its wealth and resources. So I hope that listeners that are in the fray will keep that in mind. I think something has changed in the last few years in our students' attitudes to cities. It's still not a dominant story. Most students still care deeply about preservation and historic buildings, but I do see this sort of a backlash bubbling up. So I think we should all be very careful, I think, and judicious in how we make decisions about how to celebrate the past and what to preserve and how to move forward with the past.
I think it's a fair criticism. It's one that we've talked about here before in different ways. We had Bonnie McDonald on, who did a project people could go back and listen to it called the Relevancy Project, and sort of talking about how preservation needs to be relevant to the challenges of communities today, and that preservation in the 1960s was relevant and responding to the challenges of that moment. But those aren't still the challenges of today. And so now, if the challenge is affordable housing in some communities, well, what role can preservation play in supporting that? How can we use preservation tools to create more abundant housing and cool housing types and typologies? And how do we do infill development and allow our cities to evolve, but still, have a look and feel that is unique to them? So, I mean, it's a fair criticism, but it's one that I know a lot of people in the preservation community are dedicated to trying solving. But I think you're right about the backlash piece.
And I think that's good politically, but it's also good to preserve a richer sense of the past that's not just about the built fabric, but about social dynamism too, right? And also about change. I mean, preserving, the ability of cities to kind of reinvent themselves in responsible,
we all have to evolve. Before we go, we ask everybody, we make them squirm a little bit, your favorite historic place or site. So is there a place that you just love, you could go back to over and over again?
Yeah. So, now that I've made this kind of, call for openness to change, I'm going to decry the destruction of a building that, I care deeply about. The soccer stadium of Maracanã in Rio, which is built in 1950 and had the most extraordinary acoustics and sort of form of certainly any place that I can think of. So it's a place I grew up going to, and that was, unfortunately, the facade was kept, but the bulk of the building was, I think, very irresponsible way destroyed for the World Cup in Brazil in the 2010s. So that's a place that, did you say a place that we can still go back to?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a favorite place, a place. Yeah.
All right, so I'll say that. I'll say the Maracanã. I mean, I live in a campus with lots of just fabulous historic architecture, but I'll go to a typology. Just the square. The European Italian style piazza. You have a lot of that in Latin America too. You have some of that in the U.S. and elsewhere. But just those kinds of places where you can sit and watch life go by forever. And that, again, I think combine cities as places of fixity, right? The enclosed space with very careful, beautiful architecture, and of flux, people coming by, social change,
Yeah, the dynamism that you talked about. Yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with a good square.
Can't go wrong with a good square.
You can't go wrong with a good square. Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. We could have you back probably 10 times and not cover everything I'd want to cover. So I appreciate you indulging all these different questions and digging into this. It's a fascinating book. It gave us the opportunity to sit down with you. Again, for listeners, the book is The Invention of the Future, A History of Cities in the Modern World with Bruno Carvalho. We've been talking with him this entire time. The link is in the show notes, so you can jump in there, buy yourself a copy, and support good historical research. It's been a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Nick. And, congratulations on all the great work.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.